without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker for this evening. George Melrod graduated from Harvard University, but has been a student of the Civil War all of his life. He's written extensively about visual art and culture. He's written historical fiction, and he also taught writing at UCLA. He's been fascinated by the what-ifs of the Civil War, and his presentations strive to re-examine forgotten figures of that era through abundant imagery and compelling visual storytelling. He's a member of the Los Angeles Civil War Roundtable, and he spoke to us last year on the story of John Gibbon, Iron Man of the Army of the Potomac. Tonight he'll be speaking about General Ormsby Mitchel, and you're in for quite the show. So please welcome George Melrod.
Thanks everybody, it's just a pleasure to be here. It's always such a knowledgeable group, and I'm a member now too, so I can speak knowledgeably about you. I do find these obscure characters, and I just find them fascinating who have lived these full lives. I think you'll find this guy very interesting. It seems that every generation has one guy whose job it is to make astronomy popular, to get people jazzed about the stars and planets. When I was young, that person was Carl Sagan. In recent years, the torch has passed to Neil deGrasse Tyson. However, America's first celebrity astronomer lived in the 1840s and 50s and became a fascinating Civil War general. And that astronomer was that rather dour-looking gentleman, Ormsby Mitchel, who can really be called the Carl Sagan of the 1800s. Although totally forgotten today, Mitchel was a renowned figure in the decades prior to the Civil War, whose public lectures and zealous advocacy made him the most famous astronomer in the United States. This engraving is from a book called Young Americans, History of Modern Heroes. As you can see, there's Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Farragut, Erickson, who of course designed the ironclad warships, and in the lower right, there's Ormsby Mitchel. And this is obviously from after the war, so it gives you an idea of how respected he was. One historian called him the most eminent private citizen to ever become a Civil War general. Who's Ormsby Mitchel, and why remember him? Besides being America's first popular astronomer, he founded the largest astronomy in the country. During the Civil War, he captured Huntsville, Alabama. He also directed the famous Andrews raid, which you might know of as the Great Locomotive Chase, and created the first community for freed slaves in the United States. In a way, Mitchel is the opposite of the guy I spoke about last year, General John Gibbon, who was at the center of almost every major battle in the Eastern Theater, and just the center of so much history. Whereas Mitchel was mostly at the fringes of the action, in the Western Theater and then later at the coast, and never even fought in a major battle. But he's a fascinating man with a rather tragic life and a significant legacy, and almost totally forgotten today, and I'm really excited to share his story with you. The first part of my talk tonight will be about his life and career before the Civil War, an astronomer mainly. Then we'll look at his unique role in the Western Theater, including the Great Locomotive Chase, which is a rip-roaring tale. And then finally, we'll examine his role as the founder of the nation's first community for freed slaves, and take a look at his overall legacy. So we're going to look at his life, and thank you, sir. So we're going to look at his life before the Civil War as an astronomer. We're going to look at his unique role in the Western Theater, including the Great Locomotive Chase, which is a story you might well know. And finally, we'll examine his role as the founder of the nation's first community for freed slaves. And we'll take a look at his overall legacy. I've got a ton of cool images for you, and even a few sound effects. So let's get into it, and I think it'll be fun. Ormsby Mitchel is born in 1809 in western Kentucky as the youngest child to hardy pioneer stock. After his father dies, in 1814, his mother takes him and his 4 siblings to Lebanon, Ohio, that charming town pictured there. He would have been 2 years old when the Great Comet of 1811, a very large comet that was visible for half a year, passed over the Midwest, perhaps just old enough to be awed by it. An early story about him comes from an older brother who wrote that when Mitchel was a child viewing the night sky, he once declared, "Mans can't make moons." So, from a very early age, he was clearly fascinated by the stars. Clearly a smart kid, he was sponsored to attend West Point by Ohio politician and future Supreme Court Justice John McLean, and is admitted to the class of 1829, which includes future Confederate leaders you may have heard of, Robert E. Lee and Joseph E. Johnston, graduating 15th out of 46. He remains to teach mathematics at West Point for the next 3 years. In 1830, Mitchell meets a 19-year-old military widow named Louisa Clark Trask, and they get engaged over the objections of her parents, who find the young officer too bookish. By 1832, Mitchell and his bride are stationed in Fort Marion in St. Augustine, Florida. But finding garrison life is not for him, he quits the service, and in 1833, he moves with his young wife to the bustling Queen City of Cincinnati, where he starts a law practice with Edward E. Mansfield. It doesn't last long. As Mansfield, later one of the city's leading journalists, recalled, "We were really literary men, and our thoughts wandered off to other subjects." The consequence was what might have been expected. Mitchell resorted to teaching classes, and I became a writer. In 1836, Mitchell gets hired by Cincinnati College as a professor of mathematics, mechanics, and engineering. And by 1841, his duties were extended to giving lectures on astronomy. And they became special occasions that were received with uncommon favor. Even members of the students' families would come out and hear them, which led to an invitation for him to lecture in a quote-unquote more commodious place. Wanting to give his pupils a clearer sense of what the planets and other phenomena actually look like, he comes up with the idea of buying a telescope, and the spark of a lifelong obsession was kindled. Ever a restless spirit, during his time off from teaching, Mitchell surveyed his routes for the Little Miami Railroad to gain extra income for his young family. And there's obviously Miami, Ohio, and the Little Miami Railroad was a regional line that went from Cincinnati to Springfield, Ohio. And you can see part of the rail is preserved as a walking, biking path. By now, Mitchell's ambitions and his goal is to create a world-class astronomical observatory for Cincinnati. As a first step, he convinces prominent Cincinnati winemaker, landowner, and philanthropist Nicholas Longworth to donate 4 acres on nearby Mount Ida for his proposed observatory. Now, at that time, the land was being used as vineyards because, fun fact, in the mid-1800s, Cincinnati was in fact the leading wine-producing region in the United States. As you can see from this charming vintage label promoting Longworth's Sweet Catawba brandy. To raise funds for his observatory, Mitchell comes up with the idea of selling shares to the public, whose members would be able to look through the telescope. Estimating the total cost of the project at $7,500, he offers 300 shares at $25 each to the leading citizens of Cincinnati, and within months it sold out all of them. Meanwhile, to stir up excitement and raise funds, he begins an astronomy lecture tour, which takes him to cities like Boston and New York, gaining him renown as the first celebrity astronomy orator. The lectures cover such topics as the nature of the stars and planets, and the vast galaxies beyond, which he often frames in dramatic oratory. In one of his lectures, later collected in The Orbs of Heaven, he declares, "Music is here, but it's the deep and solemn harmony of the spheres. Poetry is here, but it must be read in the characters of light, written on the sable garments of the night. Architecture is here, but it is the colossal structure of the sun and system, of cluster and universe. Go with me in imagination and join in the nightly vigils of the astronomer. Join your own sympathetic efforts to his, hope with his hope, tremble with his fears, and rejoice with his triumphs. Let it be remembered that the astronomer ever lives and never dies," he exclaims. The sentinel upon the watchtower is relieved from duty, but another takes his place, and the vigil is unbroken. No, the astronomer never dies. In 1842, Mitchell travels to Europe and visits the famed Fraunhofer Optical Institute in Munich, where he buys a beautiful new 11-inch lens that had already been ground. He orders a tube constructed for it out of brass and mahogany, and then the finished telescope is eventually shipped up to to New Orleans, up the Mississippi and Ohio rivers to Cincinnati. But while in Ohio, he visits director Francois Arago at the Paris Observatory and gazes through their telescope, which is one of the best in the world. And on his return, he works at the Royal Greenwich Observatory in London for a few months. So by now, he's gained experience really as a world-class astronomer. This is an image of another Fraunhofer telescope, similar to what he was buying, and you can get a sense of the scale and design of the device. Hoping to get 77-year-old ex-President John Quincy Adams, an ardent astronomy buff, to dedicate the site, Mitchell travels all the way to Niagara Falls to persuade him. The elderly Adams makes the journey to Cincinnati. And on November 9th, 1843, he gives a speech and lays a cornerstone for a new Cincinnati observatory atop Mount Ida, which is renamed Mount Adams in his honor. And by the way, Adams had a lovely phrase for observatories. He called them lighthouses to the sky.
That's cute.
On the left, by the way, is the site today. It's seen from Eden Park in Cincinnati, and you get a sense of how steep and densely wooded it is. So what Mitchell had to do at the time was create an infrastructure for a new observatory building and haul this very delicate, expensive technology up the hillside and install it very precisely and exactly, which was a kind of a complicated and impressive task in and of itself. When the new Cincinnati Observatory opens on April 14, 1845, it makes Cincinnati into one of the country's leading centers for the study of astronomy. And that's an image of what the building looked like, rather classical building for the new observatory. And that's a famous engraving that kind of became Mitchell's signature of Mitchell standing below the telescope and looking through it. You can get a sense of how large it is. The Merz und Mahler 11-inch refracting telescope becomes the largest telescope in America and the third largest in the world. Shareholders are invited to gaze through it at the wonders of the heavens. And in fact, they'd often interrupt Mitchell at his research. And you can get a sense of the scale and how it worked from these images of the telescope today, because it's been preserved. All the gears would help it move around because it had to swivel. And there was a staircase that Mitchell would stand on to adjust it to find the right space of sky that he wanted to look through. And there was a slat in the ceiling. And gazing through it, suddenly the distant orbs of space were pulled into dazzling focus. To spur further interest and income, in 1846, Mitchell becomes editor of the nation's first astronomy magazine, called The Sidereal Messenger. Each issue offered 8 pages of text, plus engravings, and featured separate sections for both popular and scientific interest. In 1847, Mitchell is the first person to use the phrase island universes in English to denote galaxies. How wonderful is the thought that space is richly strewn with these island universes. Next to the Milky Way, the object is to find out what is beyond. Is there anything beyond? Have we reached the end? No. If we were there, we should find 10,000 mighty island universes beyond, whose suns must be at least 1,000 millions. During the 1850s, drawing from his lectures, Mitchell writes half a dozen astronomy guides, among them The Orbs of Heaven, or Stellar and Planetary Worlds, Popular Astronomy, and The Astronomy of the Bible. This gives you an idea of some of the illustrations. Here's a few of the books. That's the planetary and stellar orbs on the left with his famous telescope on the cover. Popular Astronomy, the center, with the image of the Cincinnati Observatory. And that's a portrait of Mitchell as a dashing young astronomer on the right. Beyond his lecture tour, during the 1840s and 50s, Mitchell made over 50,000 notations of distant stars, galaxies, nebulae, solar spots, and comets. Among his discoveries was the fact that Antares is actually a double star. And he was also active in inventing devices for measuring the ascension of stars and for measuring telegraphic longitude. So he really was a scientist. He wasn't just a promoter. For all his scientific know-how and love of astronomy, It must be emphasized that Mitchell was also very deeply a man of faith, who viewed the universe as proof of God's majestic creation. As he wrote in his book, The Orbs of Heaven, of the first day after man's creation, the curiosity excited on this first solemn night, the consciousness that in the heavens God had declared his glory, the eager desire to comprehend the mysteries that dwell in these bright orbs, have clung to the descendants of him who first watched and wondered. So to him, faith and science were not mutually exclusive, but rather inextricably linked. Balancing his ambition and zeal, Mitchell's wife, Louisa, proved a highly valuable advisor and supporter. In Cincinnati, she greatly aided his career with her social graces. And in 1846, she was likely the first woman ever to see Neptune, gazing through the telescope as Ormsby adjusted it, and then declaring, "There it is, there's the planet, with a disk round, clear, and beautiful as that of Jupiter." During the 1840s and 50s, Mitchell and his wife Louisa were prominent members of Cincinnati society. Members of Reverend Lyman Beecher's Calvinist congregation, they were friends of the Beecher family, including abolitionist pastor Henry Ward Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe, who would famously write Uncle Tom's Cabin after she moved to Maine. And that's a kind of famous photograph of Henry Ward Beecher on the left, who later moved to Brooklyn, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, of course. So although Cincinnati was actually a very southern city and was located just across the Ohio River from the slave state of Kentucky, numerous of the citizens, including Mitchell's circle, were in fact abolitionists. Mitchell quits teaching to run the observatory, but it's no pay, so he takes a position as a construction engineer for the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad. Meanwhile, he also continues to give popular lectures about astronomy to avid audiences around the country. Although they're kind of ordinary, I love these images because they just give a sense of the excitement of the railroad at that time in the 1840s, because it was changing and uniting America. I mean, just this poster here. Cincinnati and St. Louis route, New York to St. Louis, Cairo, Vincennes, Evansville, Louisville, and Madison via Cincinnati and Ohio and Mississippi Railroad, the only broad gauge railroad in the West. After his wife, Louisa, suffers a stroke in 1858 to support his family, Mitchell gets a paying job in Albany as the director of the new Dudley Observatory. After working for both facilities for 2 years in Cincinnati, in 1860 he moves his family to Albany to attend her health. Over the spring of 1860, Mitchell's assistant at the Dudley Observatory was a young astronomer named August Sontag, who became a favorite of Mitchell and his family. In July, Sontag left to join the Hayes Arctic expedition to the North Pole, during which he tragically perished. A year later, Mitchell belatedly received a letter from his young protege, which must have felt like a voice from the grave. In it, he describes their passage from Boston to Discovery Island and their subsequent inability to get all the furs they wanted due to the mortality of their dogs and the consequent failure of the reindeer hunt. And now, my dear professor, I must say the last goodbye. I can never thank you enough for all your kindness and for the interest which you've taken in my welfare. The prospect of being again with you after my return encourages me more than anything. Please remember me kindly to your family and give Mrs. Mitchell my most sincere wishes for the improvement of her health. Your most sincere and grateful friend, August Sontag. That's an engraving of Sontag writing in his journal during the expedition on the left. And on the right, that's a stereographic photograph of their ship locked in the ice on the edges of the North Pole. In 1860, Mitchell speaks to his largest audience yet in a series of lectures at the prestigious 4,000-seat Academy of Music in Union Square in New York, which had just been completed in 1857. In part, it's to help with the campaign to create an observatory inside Central Park, which was never built, I guess, luckily, because you could say that Manhattan is maybe the epicenter of light pollution in the United States and the world. But that said, he was basically playing the Madison Square Garden of his time, playing huge auditoriums to rapt crowds. As the secession crisis unfolds in 1861, Mitchell gives passionate orations in Cincinnati and New York City, where he returns to Union Square for a giant patriotic rally after Fort Sumter in April 1861. I am ready, God help me, to do my duty. I am ready to fight. I feel I'm ready for something. I only ask for permission to act, and in God's name, give me something to do, he announces to the crowd. On August 18th, 1861, Mitchell bids sad farewell to his ailing wife, who, although desperately ill, insists that Ormsby accept the officer's commission that he's offered and go to Washington. As Mitchell's son Frederick later wrote, that period called out many instances of woman's fortitude, but none more marked than that of this wife, expecting the summons of death at any moment, sending her husband out to encounter the dangers of war. The next day, Louisa Clark Trask Mitchell, his wife of 30 years, suffers a third paralytic stroke and dies. Grief-stricken, Mitchell returns to Albany, leaving his daughters with family friends and taking his 2 sons with him as his aides. He departs for Washington. At first, Mitchell is assigned a brigade in the Army of the Potomac under Franklin, but as one of Cincinnati's leading citizens, he's soon sent west, where he's put in charge of the Department of the Ohio, based in Cincinnati, replacing George Melrod. And that's a nice engraving of a young Brigadier General, Ormsby Mitchell. In November 1861, Mitchell is replaced by General Don Carlos Buell, but is given command of the 3rd Division in Buell's Army of Ohio, with Thomas Crittenden, William Bull Nelson, and Alexander McCook. That's Mitchell on the left. If you can see, he's kind of a neat, composed, prim man, maybe about 5'6", whereas Bull Nelson on the far right was a giant of a man over 6 foot. It's an imposing team, but by 1865, all of them would be gone from field command. McCook and Crittenden taking partial blame for Chickamauga, although Crittenden later fought in the Overland Campaign, and hot-headed Bull Nelson being shot and killed by another Union general after slapping him in a Kentucky hotel. Marching south from Louisville, Kentucky, Buell's army attacks the provisional Confederate state capital at Bowling Green. Mitchell bombards the city from nearby Baker Hill. The rebels flee, and it surrenders. And the photo is of a historic marker on Baker Hill, the site from which Mitchell's guns bombarded the city. And it's kind of a useful map to see Buell's army's progress in those first weeks and months, going down from Louisville, Bowling Green, to Nashville, and to Tennessee, where it begins to split up. Crossing into Tennessee, Buell's army marches to the state capital, Nashville, and negotiates its surrender. Then Colonel Kennett takes possession of the city on behalf of General Mitchell, making it the first Confederate capital to fall to U.S. troops. It was a bitter necessity to many, a most welcome transition to others who had not ceased to love the old flag, he writes. After the Union Army occupies Nashville, General Mitchell calls on the widow of former President James Knox Polk at her manor called Polk Place with some other officers, during which the ex-First Lady states, "General, I trust this war will speedily terminate by the acknowledgement of Southern independence." All eyes turn to Mitchell, and he kind of mansplains the Union point of view to her. He says, Madam, the man whose name you bear was once President of the United States," which you assume she knew already. "He was an honest man and a true patriot. He describes how her husband administered the laws fairly, which do not allow any section to secede from the rest, and that if the mute lips of the honored dead who lie near us could speak, they would express the hope that the war might never cease if that cessation were purchased by a dissolution of the Union of the States over which he once presided," which apparently put an end to the rather awkward incident. With Buell's consent, Mitchell marches his division south through Murfreesboro, Shelbyville, and Fayetteville, Tennessee, basically putting Mitchell and his division in charge of all of central Tennessee. It's a fun engraving of him on his horse. As the rest of Buell's forces hurried west to reinforce Grant's army at Shiloh, arriving famously the evening of April 6th, Mitchel leads his division separately south in a difficult forced march, and on April 11th, he attacks the vital railroad depot of Huntsville, Alabama, and captures it without a fight. It marks the deepest penetration into Confederate territory that the North had yet achieved. What makes Huntsville so important is this location along the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. Completed in 1857, the Memphis and Charleston was the main artery in the Confederacy linking the Atlantic Ocean with the Mississippi. And the central hub is Chattanooga. Now let me see if I can get my little laser light here going. And if you look at this map, you can see why Mitchel becomes obsessed with capturing Chattanooga, which at this point, by the way, is still very lightly fortified. Here we are. Let me get the laser pointer. So this is Huntsville. This is where they're capturing. And there's a north-south railroad there too, and Huntsville is right here. And he marched to Huntsville very deliberately to try to break up this railroad, which is the east-west spine. But if you head a little east, Chattanooga. Now you head northeast from Chattanooga, you've got Lee's armies, Richmond, Shenandoah, Shredder Iron Works, all the agriculture in the Shenandoah. And you head southeast from Chattanooga, you've got Charleston, Savannah, Atlanta, with all the industry around Atlanta and all its agriculture. So as you can see, Chattanooga is where it's at. That's the fulcrum. And as a railroad man, Mitchel realizes how vital this central artery is. So he figures if he can capture Chattanooga before the Confederates can reinforce it and wreak havoc on their supply lines, he could potentially end the war years earlier than it might take otherwise. Now back at Shelbyville, Mitchel had met with a Union scout and quinine smuggler named James Andrews, who had previously proposed to take 8 men and burn a bridge in Bridgeport, Alabama, though that plot had been aborted. This time, Andrews proposes a daring new plan: take 24 men from Chattanooga into Georgia, steal a train, then drive it back to Chattanooga, burning bridges and cutting telegraph lines and wrecking track along the way. Seeing it as a way to help isolate Chattanooga, Mitchel approves the plan. Then Andrews gathers 22 volunteers from 3 Ohio brigades, along with an affable, hulking civilian named William Campbell. As Andrews explained to Mitchel, according to the author Russell S. Bonds in his excellent 2006 book, The Great Locomotive Chase, they would break into small squads, then go eastward into the Cumberland Mountains, cross into Chattanooga, and from there take passage on a train for Marietta, Georgia. Before the mission, Mitchel meets with Private Wilson Brown of the 21st Ohio, who is to be the main engineer of the captured train. "Your mission is very hazardous," Brown later recalled Mitchel telling him. "It is not pleasant for me to send such a number of men into the enemy's power. But in war, great risks must be run. Armed treason must be met and conquered. If you die in a glorious cause. Glorious cause." The 22 men from 3 Ohio units were each given passes and funds to buy civilian clothes in nearby Shelbyville. While shopping at a general store, Private Alf Wilson runs into Sergeant Marion Ross, a modest, blonde-bearded Antioch graduate from the 2nd Ohio, recalled Wilson. "I put a few cautious questions to him and answered as many in return when we both became convinced we were on the same errand." As the raiders gathered outside Shelbyville in civilian clothes, Andrews addressed them. "Now, my braves," he says, "there is little doubt that we will burn the bridges and that General Mitchel will occupy Chattanooga, the most important strategic point in the Confederacy. Our work is the entering wedge to more important movements, which will result in a speedy suppression of the rebellion, the restoration of the peace, and our return to our homes and to our peaceful pursuits." Despite poor weather, the bands made their way through the Cumberland Mountains, crossing the Confederate lines into Chattanooga. Along the way, the men have various adventures. One of them, named William Dorsey, using an effective Southern accent, convinced the Confederate sentry who stopped him that he was heading to Atlanta to enlist, stating, "We fight for the South. We sedish." He got in. While two other raiders, after similar questioning, were forced to enlist as Confederate soldiers on the spot. Their accents weren't that convincing, and it reduced their number down to 22. On April 11th, the secret teams of 22 men all board a train in Chattanooga, heading south through Georgia into the heart of the Confederacy. They debark at Marietta, Georgia, about 20 miles north of Atlanta. They all spend the night at Marietta, Georgia. The photo at left shows a figure of Andrews in his room at the Fletcher House, later Kennesaw House Hotel, on that fateful morning of April 12th. And it's now the Marietta History Center. And then the men all meet up that morning. Sergeant Marion Ross, the ranking officer, feels that they should abort the raid due to their delays, as Mitchel wouldn't know their schedule. Andrews disagrees, and they vote to continue. Then they take a train 8 miles north from Marietta to the station at Big Shanty, because that station lacked a telegraph station. There, they board and seize the General with its 3 empty cars as the crew are at a nearby hotel eating breakfast. And leaving the startled crew behind, the intrepid raiders start northward. The Great Locomotive Chase has begun. And the train steams northward at dizzying speed of up to 20 miles an hour. And there's just a little Chattanooga choo-choo in there to keep you on your toes. Heading north from Big Shanty, the raiders cut telegraph lines and attempt to burn the bridges. Taking the lead in cutting the telegraph lines is Sergeant John M. Scott, a handsome newlywed of 23, who had enlisted just a week before, described by Alf Wilson as one of the best men in our party, quiet, determined, persevering, and brave, who would clamber up and down the poles to cut the wires. Meanwhile, Confederate conductor William A. Fuller chases the stolen General doggedly, relentlessly, with foreman Anthony Murphy, first on foot, running after it, then up with a hand car, one of those things that you pumping like that, then on a train called the Yonah, then on the William R. Smith, and finally commandeering a southbound train called the Texas and driving it backwards. Now, because there was only one track, except for at the stations when the tracks split, the raiders on the General had to keep on a tight schedule and pull over at each station to let the southbound trains pass, pretending that they were heading north with much needed ammunition for General Beauregard. But at Kingston, they're forced to wait nearly an hour as the southbound trains pass. And from then on, Fuller is close behind them, hindering any further attempts at sabotage. Near Tunnel Hill, the raiders experience a close call as the Confederates nearly catch up. So they're unable to damage the tunnel, and because it's raining now, they're unable to burn the wooden bridges that they pass through either. Running out of fuel, the raiders abandon the General at Ringgold, Georgia, after a run of over 87 miles, south of Chattanooga. Then they disperse into the hills, followed closely by pursuing Confederates. Over the ensuing days, all of the men were captured. As leader, Andrews was hanged first in Atlanta on June 7th, after consulting meekly with the Reverend in front of a small crowd. 7 others were then hanged on June 18th. One of them, Private George Wilson, makes an eloquent speech from the gallows, stating that there were soldiers doing their duty and shouldn't be treated as spies. "We are here to die as Union soldiers who undertook to do in one day that which will cost the country millions of dollars and thousands of lives to accomplish in years." He tells the crowd that he held no ill will against them, but predicts that many of them would live to see the American flag flying and waving over the spot where we, as soldiers, are about to give up our lives. "This seems hard," he says, "but if it be the will of him, we are ready." Then the 7 men are hanged. 2 of them, including hulking William Campbell, are so heavy that their ropes break, and they have to be rehanged. One of them is overheard stating that if the ropes broke a second time, he would have no more to do with the assignment. Alf Wilson, one of the survivors, later recalled the awe he felt at his comrade's stoic courage. Sergeant Marion Ross, who was among the unlucky 7, who had been the most depressed after their sentence, in his final hours had become quite peaceful. "Boys, tell them at home, if any of you escape, that I died for my country and I did not regret it." But what happens to the remaining survivors is an amazing story in itself. Fearing execution over the fall, some of them launch a dramatic escape from their Atlanta prison. And although some of them are recaptured, 8 escape and head out into the wilderness in predetermined pairs. 2 of the men take a canoe and head west across northern Alabama and finally join the Union camp at Corinth, Mississippi. 4 others make their way north to Union Army camps in Kentucky. 2 more, Alf Wilson and Mark Wood, hoping to evade pursuers, almost counterintuitively head south down the Chattahoochee River to the Gulf of Mexico, where they are rescued by a Union blockade ship, then eventually set on to the Union fort in Key West. The last 4 prisoners were exchanged in March of 1863, so after the hangings, all of the other ones survived. On March 1863, 6 of the raiders are awarded the nation's very first medals of honor. First to get his medal is the youngest, Private Jacob Parrott, who had been badly whipped by his captors in a futile attempt to make him talk. Eventually, 19 of the raiders will receive medals. Because of clerical errors, 2 of them, including George Wilson, who had made the eloquent speech at the gallows, are somehow left out. As civilians, neither Andrews nor Campbell receives any award. In 1863, a book by one of the raiders, Private William Pittenger, titled "Daring and Suffering," recounts his exploits and ordeal in captivity and helps popularize the tale. And in the ensuing years, numerous of the other raiders come out with their own accounts, and some of them are more made up than others and contradict each other. After the war, the executed raiders are reinterred in Chattanooga Cemetery, joined by Andrews, who had been buried separately in 1887. And in 1890, the state of Ohio adds a tribute to the fallen raiders with a sculpture of the locomotive on a marble plinth. Almost half a century later, in 1908, 7 surviving raiders reunited at the monument in their old age. But the story continues to seep into popular culture. In 1927, Buster Keaton makes his classic solemn comedy, The General, based loosely on Pittenger's memoir. Notably, Keaton plays the role of the heroic Southern conductor who single-handedly chases the locomotive and wins the girl. And you see a glimpse of one of his classic physical stunts. In 1956, Disney produced a Technicolor drama based on the incident called The Great Locomotive Chase, which brought the story to an international audience. And here are some posters for the movie from France and Denmark. Today, both the General and the Texas are on display in museums around Atlanta. And here's a medallion created for the 100th anniversary of the incident in 1962. And note, the only portrait on the medal was that of the Confederate conductor who chased down the daring Union raiders. And less than a year ago, on July 4th, 2024, President Biden corrects the historical record and officially awards the Medal of Honor to those 2 soldiers who had been left out, Philip Shadrach and George Wilson, who had spoken so eloquently from the gallows on behalf of all of them. So it's an extraordinary story that really resonated around the world. And yet, in a tragic irony, the man who sent them out, Ormsby Mitchel, never knew their fate. Because in those days, they didn't have reliable communications, especially with the fog of war. At first, Mitchell had no idea what happened to his daring team, and when he did hear it was tragically incorrect, recalled his son, Frederick Mitchell. He was very much moved when it was reported to him that all had been captured and hanged at Chattanooga, a statement which was not true. He never spoke about the expedition or its purposes to any member of his staff now living.
Moonshine.
I wish. Starting April 23rd, Mitchell fights a series of small battles at Bridgeport, Alabama, and captures the town with his vital railroad bridge. Mitchell hopes to use the bridge to move on Chattanooga, but to his frustration, Buell and Halleck order it burned. Up north, the New York Herald runs the breathless headline, "Northern Alabama and Western Georgia at the mercy of General Mitchell." Unfortunately, the dramatic tone proves to be justified. To cut off the North-South Railroad, Mitchell orders Colonel John Basil Turchin and his 8th Brigade to occupy Athens, Alabama. But on May 1st, a contingent of Louisiana cavalry drives them out as the residents jeer. In the process, 2 Ohio soldiers are burned to death in a supply train, while a few civilians supposedly join in the fight as snipers. As the rebel Colonel J.S. Scott reported, "My boys took few prisoners, their shots proving singularly fatal." In Huntsville, Mitchell angrily orders Turchin to retake the town. The next day, Russian-born Turchin returns in force with his brigade. Then he announces, "For the next 2 hours, I shut my eyes and see nothing." After which his men, including the 18th Ohio and foreign-born soldiers in the 19th and 24th Illinois, proceed to plunder the town and terrified citizens, stealing food, silver, jewelry, ruining a medical library, and despoiling homes. The story goes that director of the Athens Female Institute, Mary Jane Hamilton Childs, courageously prevented Union troops from entering the school by showing them a letter to her supposedly written by Abraham Lincoln. On learning of the incident, horrified, Mitchell hurries to the town where he urges the citizens to gather complaints, vowing to punish those responsible. But Buell was openly aghast, having promised the Southerners would be treated with dignity under his command. Calling the sack of Athens an atrocity, Buell orders Turchin court-martialed. The presiding judge would be General James A. Garfield. For 10 days, the Alabama citizens testify against the brutal Muscovite. In the end, Turchin is found guilty of all the charges against him. But his wife pleads for mercy to Stanton. And so, instead of being expelled from the army, Turchin gets a promotion to brigadier general, which actually invalidates the verdict because he's now of a higher rank than almost all the jury except for Garfield. And as it so happens, he later distinguishes himself in the battles of Chickamauga and Chattanooga. But the reason that he's let off speaks to how the mood around the war had shifted. By now, the North had grown angry at the carnage and began to favor a harsher stance toward the rebellious South, and they felt that punishing Turchin would be politically unpopular. But the event stains Mitchell's command, allowing rivals such as Halleck to contend that he was unable to control his men and potentially corrupt. Athens aside, the period after Andrew's raid, while he was still commanding his independent division on the edge of the Confederate interior, had to be the most promising and frustrating of his military career. As a strategist, Mitchell itched to apply his restless energy toward taking the initiative in capturing the gateway city of Chattanooga while it was still only lightly defended. But with under 15,000 men and saddled with a hesitant commanding officer in Buell and a jealous one in Halleck, he simply couldn't get support to realize his ambitious plans. Even so, Mitchell sends General James Negley to attack Chattanooga with his brigade, and on June 7th, Negley launches a day-long artillery bombardment of the city. But realizing that he couldn't hold the city, Negley withdraws the next day. Known as Negley's Raid, or more grandly as the First Battle of Chattanooga, the attack proved that the Union could strike deep inside the enemy heartland. And the lesson is probably intended as much for Mitchell's own superiors as it is for the Confederates. On June 28th, Buell relocates his headquarters to Huntsville, joining Mitchell, effectively ending his detached command and returning him to a more directly subordinate position. Unsurprisingly, this aggravates the two officers' already strained relationship. As Mitchell urges Buell to give him more men to advance on Chattanooga, and Buell resists, Mitchell's protests begin to veer toward open insubordination. As New York Tribune editor Horace Greeley later wrote, had he been even moderately reinforced, he would have struck and probably could have destroyed the great rebel armories and foundries in Georgia, or have captured Chattanooga. But instead, on June 30th, Mitchell telegraphed Secretary of War Edmund Stanton, finding it impossible to serve my country longer under my present commander, I have today forwarded through him my unconditional resignation and respectfully solicit a leave of absence for 20 days. Stanton grants Mitchell's request for leave, but rejects his resignation, and Mitchell heads east to await reassignment. And in July, Mitchell is promoted to the rank of Major General. 2 weeks later, comet Swift-Tuttle is discovered by two separate astronomers, one of whom, Lewis Swift, had fallen in love with astronomy in the 1840s while attending Mitchell's lectures. Surely the comet would be a harbinger of something, but of light. Invited to Washington, Mitchell meets with Stanton and Chase, who want Mitchell to lead a new Mississippi expedition, perhaps something like the Vicksburg campaign, which Lincoln supposedly is on board with. But the new General-in-Chief, Henry Halleck, doesn't like or trust Mitchell and shunts him aside. So despite his promotion, he winds up waiting all summer for reassignment in New York. Among the officers in Mitchell's division who he leaves behind is Colonel William Haynes Lytle, a renowned poet who had been Mitchell's student at Cincinnati College. Wounded and captured at the Battle of Perryville, Lytle was later promoted to Brigadier General and killed in 1863 at Chickamauga. But even the ordinary soldiers under his command seemed to admire Mitchell and to miss him, wrote Lieutenant John L. Hebrone of the 2nd Ohio to his family over the summer. Crittenden's division, as well as McCook's, were all nearly naked and barefoot when they came here, but they're getting new clothes now. Old Stargazer would have had them long ago. He would say, now boys, you will have new clothes pretty soon, and when he said anything, it had to come. At last, on September 3rd, 1862, Mitchell was finally given a command, the newly formed 10th Corps and Department of the South, based at Hilton Head in Beaufort, South Carolina, a base cut off from any other northern armies and accessible only by sea. After arriving there on September 15th, aboard the steamship Arago, he is greeted by the chaplain of the 48th New York Regiment, who shakes his hand and asks him affably, "Why, General, what brought you here?" To which Mitchell dejectedly replies, "I came here to be buried." Among the officers there is General Rufus Saxton, quartermaster of the Department of the South. It's Saxton who was responsible for advancing programs to help the ex-slaves who are now fleeing to the island. But although Mitchell agrees with him in principle, he longs to get back into the fight. Writing to Washington after the Battle of Antietam, he pleads, "Let me be brought north with all my veteran troops. Let me add these to my old division, and I will move and strike wherever there is work to be done. I am doing nothing here and shall die, yes, die is the word, of inaction." Drawn to the presence of the Union Army, numerous contrabands, escaped slaves, were being housed in filthy barracks, a situation which was stirring prejudice on behalf of some of the other Union officers, and which Mitchell found unacceptable. Seeing all the escaped slaves now flocking to Hilton Head, Mitchell realizes the situation demands a more permanent solution. So he divides up the land around the nearby Drayton, aka Fish Hall, plantation, and orders it built as a community for freed slaves. Mitchell holds a contest with Army engineers and the freedmen to come up with a cabin design. The design by the freedmen wins, and construction begins on a new freedmen's village. Each family is given a quarter of an acre of land and materials to build a house. Though under Army guidance, the town is largely built and managed by the freedmen, who hold elections and maintain order. They also built 3 churches, 4 stores, and a school. Most of the men worked by day for the Union Army, earning roughly between $4 and $12 per month, whereas family gardens feed the village, and neighbors traded and sold goods with each other and crops that they grow. On October 12, 1862, on the dedication of a new church for the freed blacks, Mitchell addresses the gathered community. And I apologize for any of the dated racial language. Good colored friends, you have great work to do. All the people of the free states are looking at you and the experiment now being tried on your behalf. The experiment is to give you freedom, position, home, your own families, property, your own soil. You shall till and cultivate your own crops. You shall gather and sell the products of your own industry for your own benefit. And you shall be able to feel that God is raising you to a nobler life. It seems to me, he says, a better day is dawning. A better time is coming. On October 22nd, Mitchell sends an expeditionary force under General Brannan to the Pocatello River to try to sever the Charleston and Savannah Railroad. In the ensuing battle, 50 men are killed and 300 wounded. When it's over, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard reports, Charleston Railroad uninjured, abolitionists left dead and wounded on the field. And looking at the image, by the way, of the river, you get a sense of kind of how swampy and really not particularly healthy a lot of the landscape was around those Carolina Islands. A few days later, Mitchell contracts yellow fever, a painful viral disease spread by mosquitoes, which results in fever, chills, nausea, and in some cases, liver and kidney damage, jaundice, hemorrhaging, and even death. For several days, Mitchell grapples with his illness in his Hilton headquarters, attended by his close friend, Major Birch. Meanwhile, his son, Frederick, also falls sick from the same disease in another room. On October 30th, 1862, attended by close friend Major Birch, after making sure that each of his children was to get a keepsake, his horse to one, his sword to a second, his watch to a third, Ormsby Mitchel dies at Hilton Head, South Carolina. He is 53 years old. New York Times, November 1st, 1862, the ravages of fever at headquarters, General Brannan in command. I regret I have to announce the sad news of the death of Major General Ormsby M. Mitchell, who commanded this department. He died at Beaufort on Thursday, 6:30 from a malignant fever. In the short period that he was here, he managed to win the love and confidence of his whole command. His benevolent projects for benefiting the Negro and his eminently practical course with regard to them here will cause his memory to be cherished by every Christian. In his death, our country has lost an able general, astronomy and science, one of their most gifted sons. Wrote Ohio journalist Whitelaw Reid, his was a brilliant promise, but he never fought a battle, never confronted a respectable antagonist, and never commanded a considerable army. Yet what he did so won the confidence of the troops and of the country that his death was deplored as a great calamity, and he was mourned as a great general. As Mitchell's body is transported north on the steamship Star of the South, ironically, 2 survivors of the ill-fated Andrews raid, Alf Wilson and Mark Wood, were also on board, heading to New York after the long escape through the Gulf. They are sadly surprised to be reunited with their commanding officer. I believe he died in the thought that our lives had all been sacrificed, Wilson later wrote. And if he did die so believing, it was a cause of pain and sorrow to him, for his was a noble, humane, sensitive nature, a soul of honor. Over the ensuing weeks, work continues on the new Freedmen's Village, with its homes, roads, church, and city council elected by its residents, making it the first community in the nation to be governed by ex-slaves. After it opens in November 1862, the town is called Mitchellville, in Mitchell's honor. At its peak, roughly 3,000 ex-slaves called Mitchellville home. In 1863, Harriet Tubman visits Mitchellville and helps launch the raid on Combahee Ferry with Colonel James Montgomery and the 2nd South Carolina Infantry, which rescues 750 former slaves. By 1863, Hilton Head and Mitchellville had become a center for recruiting and training soldiers of the U.S. colored troops. During the last 3 years of the Civil War, more than 94,000 ex-slaves will bravely serve the Union cause as soldiers. After the Union Army left Hilton Head in 1868, Mitchellville began to decline until eventually it was destroyed in a hurricane in 1893. In 2010, the land was reclaimed to the public as Mitchellville Freedom Park, where freedom began. And here's the site as it looks today. As you can see, the houses and streets are long gone. Another view. Here's the general's grave. Alongside those of his wife and family in Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn. Edward Holden, director of the Lick Observatory at San Jose, and the first president of the University of California, noted Mitchell's impact on American astronomy, stating that his work excited an intense and widespread public interest and indirectly led to the creation of many observatories, adding, the endowment of astronomical research in America owes a large debt to his energy and efforts. His direct legacy are his observatories. The Cincinnati Observatory moved to nearby Mount Lookout and was rebuilt in 1904. It still retains Mitchell's original telescope. But more than just those physical structures, we can say his legacy is truly the thirst for knowledge of the orbs and stars around us, and the wonder that their majesty that he strove so ardently to instill. So in many ways, his legacy includes the observatories that we have today. The Hubble Space Telescope, launched in 1990, and the James Webb Space Telescope, launched in 2021. Imagine if Mitchell could see the orbs of heaven as we see them today. Here's Mars in 1845 as depicted in the sky, and as seen today through the Hubble Space Telescope. Saturn as depicted in his guidebook, and as we know it today. The sun as depicted in his volume with its myriad sunspots and solar flares. And as scientists see it today. And what would be said if you could see it as filtered through our 21st century computer technology and data analysis? The great massive furnace at the center of our solar system, exploding with millions of atomic bombs every second. The solar system, no longer a delicate line drawing, but truly a vast, dynamic choreography of the heavenly orbs. Given that he had spent the last 2 decades of his life studying the stars and planets and zealously expounding on their wonders, one might imagine that in his final days or hours before he passed from this earth, Mitchell would visit the heavens in his mind's eye one last time, starting with the moon, our loyal satellite. Mars, the red planet, cracked and cratered with its canyons and its ice caps. Saturn, the gaseous giant with its vast icy rings and myriad moons. Jupiter, the largest of the planets, with its great red spot and swirling endless storms. Uranus with its eerie blue tilt and strange axial rings. Neptune, the farthest planet, which Mitchell and his wife were among the first human beings to observe. As he adjusted the telescope, and she exclaimed excitedly, "There it is, there's the planet, with a disk round, clear, and beautiful as that of Jupiter." Having reached the edges of the solar system, perhaps for one last time he would follow the comets that had ushered him into this world and foretold his passing, out into the depths of the universe, to the distant galaxies, to the great island universes he had spoken of so eloquently, filled with stars thousands of millions of them. How could he not proselytize the glories of the heavens? He who had seen the birth of galaxies and the death of stars, who had seen the great nebulas and discovered the double star of Antares. As one of only a handful of human beings who had witnessed with his own eyes the sublime majesty of God's celestial architecture as he saw it. And after all that, he had been brought down by a mere mosquito. The irony must have staggered him. And yet, in a short time, he'd also uncovered the chink in the armor of the Confederacy. He had sown some of the nation's first real seeds of freedom. It would have to be enough. No, the astronomer never dies. He looked forward to seeing his wife again. He hoped she would tell him she was proud of him. And that's a brief life of Ormsby Mitchel, known as Old Stars, also Old Stargazer. This is a list of some of my sources that I consulted in putting together this presentation. As you can see, most of the books are all from the 1800s. There's nothing really written about him. A couple of articles more recently. There's one large contemporary book called Stealing the General. That's by Russell Bonds, about the really a rip-roaring tale about the Great Locomotive Chase. And if you're interested in this story, I strongly recommend it. From 2006. Mitchell appears as kind of a character in that book, infrequently from time to time. I don't get the sense that Bonds particularly thinks much of him. Mitchell comes off as kind of an ambitious dilettante, which perhaps he was, and you can tell from the way he talked, his kind of a grandiose language. But I tend to admire him quite much more with his driving vision. I'd like to make a special notice about this music. It's by the contemporary classical composer named Max Richter, who you may have heard of. He composes a lot for film. The song is called On the Nature of Daylight. It was used for the movie Arrival, if you ever saw it. That's about men's meeting with an alien species for the first time. It's actually a very serious science fiction film and extremely beautiful. But I find Max Richter's music incredibly beautiful. I want to point you toward it on Spotify or something. I thought it would be a nice accompaniment to our Voyage to the Stars from Mitchell's point of view. In closing, I'd like to offer a quick thought on Mitchell's life. Although he was really kind of an extraordinary character with big plans and a driving will, his life was full of tragedy, frustration, and death. His wife died on the day he left to fight in the Civil War. His assistant died in the North Pole. He never knew what happened to the soldiers in the Great Locomotive Chase and assumed that they're all hanged. On the verge of great promise, first in Tennessee, and then with open support from the White House, he was still exiled to a remote command, and then without ever fought a major battle, he died in 1862, just as the war was heating up. Not falling gallantly in the field, but of disease. So in many ways, it was an unfulfilled life. But I don't think it was meaningless. His strategic focus on Chattanooga was clearly prescient. His inherent sense of justice led him to enact an unprecedented new civic model for freed slaves, whom he treated with dignity and respect. And his yearning for knowledge laid a seed for our own, not just in astronomy, but in an existential quest to understand our place in the universe. He didn't live to see the Union triumph or to claim a share of it. But perhaps it's not the final victory that gives a life meaning. Perhaps it's simply being part of the struggle. Anyway, I really enjoyed getting to know this forgotten figure, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have about him. Thank you so much.
Because we're in Pasadena, where do you include Thaddeus Lowe and George Hale in your list of great astronomers?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, it's a great question. I don't know if I'd call George Lowe, I don't know if I'd call Thaddeus Lowe an astronomer, really. I mean, he's a balloonist and kind of a being able to see a battlefield from above, it gives a great vantage point. But Mitchell is really not going up to look back down, he's looking out. So, and he's not the most important astronomer either, but he is the popularizer, and I was impressed that he actually was making a lot of discoveries of his own at the time. There are only a handful of astronomers really in the 1900s, and including one female one. I think there's a woman named Mary Mitchell. So, yes.
This is a question in honor of Edward Pearson, but I just wanted to know about his law career. Did he just buy a couple law books and set up a shingle, or did he go to law school, or?
Oh, the writer from the...
No, Mitchell, you said he was a lawyer for a bit in Cincinnati.
Well, his partner, whose name I forget, the Edward guy, became one of the leading journalists in Cincinnati. So, but Mitchell, I guess, went about from career to career and then settled into teaching and engineering and took it from there. I hope that if they answer that.
I guess I just misunderstood. I thought he was a lawyer for a little bit.
He was there for a little bit.
But that he just bought a couple law books, or?
I don't know. He clearly had a mathematical inclination and a scientific inclination, so I think he found something that suited him better.
So how long did that observatory in Cincinnati last?
It's still standing, which is amazing. It's the oldest observatory in the United States. Mount Ada, where he originally built it, that came out Adams, is really very close to the city. So again, once the city got expanded, they moved it several miles out to this place called Mount Lookout. And then where they built two different buildings, and they built a much larger, around 1904, they built a much larger telescope, a 16-inch lens. They measured the lens as the telescope. But they kept Mitchell's telescope in a separate building that you can still look through, and there are two buildings up there. So it's still there, and I have to tell you, I've never been to Cincinnati, and it's now on my bucket list. I really love to see it. And I think Cincinnati is fascinating because it really was a southern city, and I was surprised to find that and I had forgotten that both Harry Beecher Stowe and Lyman Beecher and Henry Ward Beecher were all from there. And I think in many ways, because it was a southern city, the famous scene from Uncle Tom's Cabin on Little Eva fleeing across the ice, came from being in Cincinnati and seeing people trying to flee in the winter from a slave state to a free state. So I was fascinated to know that even in the southern city, there was a prominent abolitionist subculture. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, in your research, did you ever come across any correspondence between him and Horace Greeley?
No, I did. It's fun to find that quote from Horace Greeley.
Yeah.
No, I didn't find that much correspondence. These things take a huge amount of research, but they also stop short of kind of what a book would do. So I'm not actually traveling or looking in libraries for first-hand accounts.
Yeah.
That said, a lot of the older books have plenty of first-hand accounts. There's a book by Frederick Mitchell, who survived, by the way, and Frederick Mitchell, neither one knew that the other was sick with yellow fever, so when Frederick Mitchell got better, he found out his father had died. But he became kind of the historian of the family. And there was actually an Ormsby Mitchell, like the third or something, who fought in World War II and tried to save the PT boat, which is interesting.
Where did you do your research? And I was curious also about the observatory in Albany, if that's still standing.
Well, it's a good question. I think the Dudley Observatory is still standing. I had read online some facts that weren't true about Mitchell, that he'd been involved in the Naval Observatory and the Harvard Observatory, and I couldn't find any news that he hadn't. And even at the Dudley Observatory, and this history goes back a long way, when all these things were being founded. And the Dudley Observatory, on their website, they say that Mitchell never set foot in it, although he was technically the director of it. But in my research, it was very clear that he'd spent 2 years in Cincinnati. So maybe he didn't set foot in the finished building, but clearly he was in Cincinnati, in charge of the observatory.
Mm-hmm.
So,
but how did you go about doing your study on this, and where did you study it?
staying up to 1:30 in the morning and winning bids on eBay. Goes a long way. I've got a lot of old books, and I try to collect little things. Like every guy I researched, I put a year into each one. But I owned this little thing. I found this beautiful signed CDB frame of Mitchell, and that was kind of looking down on me on the desk as I wrote about it. There are a lot of what ifs about everything. I mean, there's a fork in the road at every battle and every road. But I think the thing about Mitchell that I found interesting is he had a very sharp strategic sensibility. I can't tell how his tactics were. I think they're pretty strong. And he's a West Pointer, so you'd think he'd know how to do things. But he's very independent. I think for 20 years he's used to building his own observatory and going off on his own. And I think the big question with Mitchell, had he ever been brought in to fight under, the Army of the Potomac or under Sherman or something, could he follow a chain of command if he disagreed? And I think that's where the jury's out. But I have to say, looking back, I mean, Buell, you read the cliches, Buell was slow. But reading this stuff up, I go, Buell really just didn't want to fight particularly, is what it feels like today. So I can understand a guy who's really restless to fight and can say, now's the time, it's undefended. I can see how he'd be apoplectic about not getting any support. So, but we'll never know. Sir?
2 words. Why Cincinnati for the observatory? Is it because of his background in
He lived there.
But there's there's no...
There was after you put it there.
Yeah, that's right.
He lived there, and he was teaching there, and there was for his students. He wanted his students to be able to look through to see the stars, and he was getting to know Cincinnati society. It was his way of, finding a role in society that wasn't. And he really was a guy that thought outside the box, which I think is kind of rare for military guys, especially West Pointers, and he was a really imaginative guy. And I call him visionary because I really think he could see in the distance. He could see far.
Yeah, but I think on the Wright brothers, there's a reason they went to Kitty Hawk, right? And so this is a science guy, so I think there would be a scientific reason, but you're telling me no. There really was no scientific reason.
No, he was the center of the country too. The East Coast there's a naval observatory, there's a Harvard observatory. This thing about telegraphic longitude is interesting, because one thing that these telescopes would do is, once they had the telegraph set up, one guy would be and Mitchell did this, one guy would be in the Naval Observatory in Washington, then he'd be in Cincinnati, and they communicate instantaneously by the telegraph, and one could see the rise of a star in their field. Then the other one waits, and when the star rises into his field, they could kind of measure longitude, they could measure the measurements, how far the star was. So they worked among each other. So I think having one in the middle of the country balanced out the ones on the East Coast, which would have been redundant for a lot of experiments.
Thank you.
And maybe that's sweet Catawba brandy. Who knows? Yes.
Did he ever travel outside of the country, like to Europe?
Well, early on he went to Bavaria to buy that telescope, and when he was in Bavaria, he went to France and looked through the telescope there, which was a really big one. I went to England, and which is a big deal then too for a young guy. And and it's funny when he got. It's kind of an aside that he got John Quincy Adams to speak in Cincinnati. But John Quincy Adams was an old coot at this point who was really, his speech at Cincinnati was the last public speech of his life. And he loved, and it's kind of nice, it humanizes him. He loved astronomy. And he went down to Washington, apparently, to meet John Quincy Adams. And they said, oh, sorry, he's not here. Where is he? Oh, he's in Niagara Falls. So he went from Cincinnati, Washington, went up to Niagara Falls to convince him. And his wife, I think, luckily still goes, I know he's would talk about her husband, I know he's a little exuberant, but he's a good guy, he's very reliable. And so they were really a team together, and so within the strictures of the era, he was pretty well traveled, I'd say. Yes, of course.
The movie with Buster Keaton, The General, is going to be showing here in San Gabriel Valley.
What?
On September 7th.
What?
at the wonderful San Gabriel Mission Playhouse.
Thank you for, everybody hear that? That's great. Mission Playhouse, it's September 7th at the,
It's wonderful.
I mean, his stunts are amazing, and it was particularly fun. This is the first presentation I've done where I tried to use GIFs and sound effects and stuff just to see what I could do in it, and the GIFs are a lot of fun. But, I mean, I was struck by the fact that all the commemorations of the Great Locomotive Chase celebrated the lone guy who chased, the government men, whereas I can't help, writing from this point of view, seeing that these brave guys are incredible heroes, the Union Raiders, and it actually was really appealing to me and very moving when I read that those two guys, including the guy that gave the speech, actually their great-grandchildren got their medals of honor just within a year ago. So thank you all so much.